Hello, everybody. Welcome to this book presentation, The Frontlines of Peace, an insider's guide to changing the world, authored by Séverine Autesserre. My name is Kristian Herbolzheimer. I'm the director of the International Catalan Institute of Peace based in Barcelona. The art and science of building peace is in permanent evolution. We have learned a lot over the past decades, especially, I would say, after the end of the Cold War, but we still have a very long way to go. There's no peace agreement in the world that has ever been fully implemented. There's no perfect peace process in the world. We know that we need to get better at policy level, at academic level, at the practitioner level. We need to innovate. We need new analysis, policy, and practice approaches to the work. Séverine Autesserre has been literally at the front lines of peace for over 20 years, working in different capacities with NGOs, the UN system, and others, working and researching in about a dozen conflict-affected settings. Séverine is a professor of political science at Columbia University. She's author of 3 books, Trouble with Congo, Peaceland, which actually was translated to Spanish by our institute, by ICIP, and therefore for the Spanish readers available if you're interested. And today we are introducing Frontlines of Peace, a publication which is not yet available in bookshops in Europe, only in America. Séverine can give us more details later on where we can buy it and purchase it, if interested. In any case, it has created lots of interest, and just as a footnote, or to mention that Séverine was invited by the UN Security Council to present her thinking very recently. To introduce the work of Séverine, we have asked Oscar Mateos. Oscar is a coordinator of GlobalCodes, a research group on globalization, conflict, development, and security at the University of Blanquerna here in Catalonia. Oscar is also the author of the introduction to the Spanish version, the Spanish translation of Séverine's book, Peaceland, and therefore one of our local experts in Catalonia on Séverine's work. Just a couple of comments on the structure. After handing over to Oscar, we'll have the main speaker, Séverine, for some 20 minutes introducing her work. And after that, we have asked 2 guests to make initial comments and reactions. Leslie Ann Daniels, she is a research fellow at the Barcelona Institute for International Studies. She actually recently published her own book, but that's another story for another day. And Albert Caramés, coordinator of the Masters of Conflict, Peace and Conflict, also at Blanquerna University. And then just for the logistics, I invite anybody who has comments or questions, especially questions, please write those on the chat. And throughout the event, please keep your microphone muted. You can keep your cameras on or off. That's entirely up to you. And after this, without further comments, please, Oscar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kristian. We are so excited to co-organize along with SIP this very interesting event. We thank you very much, all the audience, all the attendees of this presentation, and we especially want to thank you, Séverine, for her willingness from the very first moment to stay today with us. I have to say that the GlobalCodes research group is also very happy to discuss this book, because Séverine's work has been quite present in the last years in some of our discussions. And not just in the research field. I have to say that as a lecturer at our university, many of Séverine's work have been always under high interesting discussion. First of all, one very interesting article that we always ask our students to discuss in the second year of the undergraduate program, which is Dangerous Tales, a very interesting article that she published a long time ago. Of course, the trouble with the Congo that discusses the dominant, what she calls the dominant culture and the understanding of the DR Congo conflict. The Peaceland, most recently, that systematizes all her knowledge and lessons learned in different international peace-building contexts, pointing out, we think, a very interesting, what can be considered the endogamic problems that Peaceland culture creates. And I think that the Frontlines of Peace goes even beyond these reflections and help us to understand the way beyond from some specific local context and experiences from which international peacebuilding actors can learn some of their main mistakes and problems that most times aggravate the situation. Anyway, I think that all in all, Severine's two most important contributions so far have been, on the one hand, to trace a line of continuity from the work that Mary Anderson, that she published Do No Harm in the late 1990s, began at that time, and to which important authors such as John Paul Lederach have contributed along the same lines, attempting to construct a framework which, by questioning the way in which peace is built, seeks more transformative, sociocentric strategies anchored in the role of the local. On the other hand, I think Severine's work is committed to bringing together two fields that seem increasingly distant, namely the academic world and the operational world of peacebuilding. In this sense, the last 10 years have seen an incredible upsurge in critical peace studies that have challenged the idea of the liberal peace. This is a very suggestive and stimulating debate, but sometimes I would say a bit endogamic. And I think Severine's work is key to bringing peacebuilding criticism out of this endogamy and putting it in dialogue with other forms of criticism that seek strategies to make a more social and local peacebuilding possible. For all these reasons, I believe that this new book offers us very suggestive elements of debate that we are eager to comment on and discuss. Thanks very much again for your willingness, for being here with us today. And Séverine, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Oscar, for this very, very generous introduction. Thank you to Kristian and Eugenia for organizing this event, for inviting me. Thank you, Albert and Leslie, for preparing comments. I'm very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say about the book. And thanks to all of you for joining us this morning for me, afternoon for you, I think. I'm absolutely thrilled to be talking in what I was telling Kristian is one of the very first European book launch event around the Frontlines of Peace, because the book is just becoming available in Europe. It's going to be available supposedly in all good bookstores or wherever books are sold, according to my publisher. But it's really, really important for me to be speaking with you in an event that's organized by ICIP and co-hosted by Oscar, because as Kristian and Oscar said, ICIP was the organization that, and Oscar was the person who spurred the translation, the Spanish translation of my Peaceland book into Spanish, which has been huge for me. And I'm so glad that at least part of my work is available for Spanish language readers. So thank you again for joining us. And I understand that we have people who are joining us from all over Spain. And if I understood correctly, the list of participants, we may have people also from Latin America, which is absolutely fantastic. As for me, I'm talking with you from my home in New York City, because due to the COVID pandemic, I still cannot access my office. But it doesn't matter, because I'm absolutely thrilled to be talking with you about my brand new book, The Frontlines of Peace. And now you should be able to see my slide. Yeah, okay, great. So The Frontlines of Peace is a book about hope. It's a book about the ordinary and yet extraordinary individuals and communities that have found effective ways to confront violence. And that in itself is extremely important because, as you know, 1.5 billion people live under the threat of violence in more than 50 conflict zones around the world, in the countries that you see in red here on my map. And so you all know that if you're participating in this event, peace building is a crucial task for many states and international institutions. And by peace building, I really mean any and all actions that help promote peace before, during, and after a conflict. The thing is that, as I mentioned, and as I explained in my Peaceland book, our templates and techniques for approaching war and peace just don't work. Afghanistan, Colombia, Congo, Syria, Ukraine, Myanmar, we've heard the same story many times before. There was violence, the United Nations got involved, donor countries pledged millions in assistance, warring parties called for ceasefires, they signed agreements, held elections, and the headlines praised peace. And then a week or two later, sometimes just days later, violence flared up again. Sometimes it had never actually stopped. And in many cases, it continued for years after. You know that more than half of all ongoing wars have already lasted for more than 20 years. In just the past 5 years, wars have spawned the worst refugee crisis since World War II. And there has been plenty of discussion about what has gone wrong when we've tried to stop wars in the past. And I've written 2 books and quite a few articles on that. But I think now it's time to ask, what has gone right? And that's the focus of my new book, The Frontlines of Peace. And it turns out that elections don't build peace, and democracy itself may not be the golden ticket, at least not in the short term. Contrary to what most politicians preach, building peace doesn't require billions in aid or massive international interventions. Instead, it often involves giving power to ordinary citizens. Ultimately, many successful examples of peace building in the past few years have involved innovative grassroots initiatives led by local people, at times supported by foreigners, just like the South African peacekeeper you see with me in the photo, and often using methods shunned by the international elite. So rather than focusing on abstract peace agreements, handshakes between presidents, and negotiations between governments and rebel leaders, the Frontlines of Peace details the concrete, everyday actions that actually make a difference on the ground. So some of these are bizarre, some, as you'll see, are creative, some involve age-old traditions, and some are just common sense. The Frontlines of Peace explains how peace building can actually work so that we can finally improve the lives of billions of people. And I show that if we want to end violence from war, and also if we want to address violent conflicts at home, whether home is New York or Barcelona or Bogota, we have to fundamentally change the way we view and build peace. And I made this argument by drawing on more than 20 years of work in 12 different conflict zones in the countries you now see in red on my map, as well as more than 800 in-depth interviews that I conducted with peace builders, warlords, survivors, ordinary people, outside observers, etc. So if you see my photos now, here on the right-hand side, you see me conducting interviews, and on the left-hand side, I'm conducting participant observations. And I was very happy that day. I thought, yay, I'm fitting in, I'm such a good ethnographer. But the thing is that I'm not a man, and there were only men on this military base. And also I felt that there was something wrong with my bulletproof jacket. So I went patrolling with the peacekeepers for several hours, and the bulletproof jacket was heavy, it was super uncomfortable, it didn't protect my heart or any of my vital organs. And I thought, well, it's normal, you know, I'm a woman, it's made for men, I'm kind of small and kind of not really big. So, it's made for people who are much stronger than I am. And it's only when we were back to the base that one of the Indian officials, at least the officer who's here, came to me and said, you've been wearing it backward. Anyway, I still got really good material that day. So let me tell you the story of Idjwi, which is quite literally an island of peace in Congo. For the past 25 years, one of the deadliest conflicts since World War II has raged around Idjwi. And despite the presence of one of the largest and one of the most expensive peacekeeping missions in the world, several million people have died and hundreds continue to die every day. But Idjwi itself has avoided mass violence. So the island is stunningly beautiful, as you can see in the photo you now see on my slide. But what makes the place even more noteworthy and the piece even more surprising is that the island contains all of the same preconditions for violence that have fueled generalized fighting in other parts of Congo. You have a geostrategic location. Idjwi is located right at the border between Congo and Rwanda, two countries that have been at war regularly since the 1990s. You also have a geostrategic location, mineral resources, ethnic tensions, lack of state authority, extreme poverty, local conflicts over land and traditional power, and many other features that have led to generalized fighting in other parts of Congo. And what's fascinating about Idjwi is that the island is peaceful because of the active, everyday involvement of all of its citizens, including the ones you see in my photos, and including the poorest and least powerful ones. So it's not the state, the police, or the army who manage to control tensions, and it's not foreign peace builders either. It is the members of the community themselves. And they do that by fostering what they call a culture of peace. They also organize in grassroots associations and local structures that help resolve conflicts. And they build on strong beliefs that help deter violence by both insiders and outsiders, such as blood pacts. Blood pacts are traditional promises between two parties who agree never to hurt each other. And so the story of Idjwi shows us that local community resources can sometimes build peace better than the usual elite agreements and outside interventions. And foreign peace builders can help in this process. So take the teams of the Life and Peace Institute in Congo. LPI is a Swedish peacebuilding organization that is involved in various conflict zones and usually focuses on working at the grassroots. And its teams in Congo have, the LPI Congo team rejects universal approaches to peacebuilding, and they rely on local employees supervised by a few foreigners, and they build on extensive pre-existing country knowledge. These foreigners often have a good command of local languages and a good understanding of local societies, politics, and cultures. LPI doesn't implement programs directly, but instead it works with and through a few handpicked local organizations. And the main role of these organizations is actually to support people on the ground. These local organizations empower ordinary citizens to develop their own analysis of their community's conflict, and then agree on the most feasible answers, just like they're doing in the photo you now see on my slide, and then implement those solutions. So you see the difference with the usual way to build peace in conflict zones. In the LPI model, it's not foreigners based in headquarters and capital cities who conceive, design, and implement peace building programs. It's not national or provincial elites either, and it's not the state or the government. Instead, it is the intended beneficiaries themselves, including combatants and including ordinary people, who conceive, design, and implement peace-building programs with the help of LPI and its local partners. So outsiders can help reestablish peace, but the catch is that to really help, they can't continue acting the way they usually do, because there are countless limitations to the conventional way to build peace, which I call Peace Inc., and which I've analyzed in my Peaceland book and in other of my publications. And Peace Inc. relies on governments, elites, and foreign peace builders, and usually excludes ordinary citizens and grassroots activists and local leaders. So Peace Inc. really relies on a number of problematic and really misleading assumptions, like the idea that only top-down intervention can end armed violence. The idea that all good things come together. So for instance, that democracy will naturally lead to peace. And the idea that only outsiders have the required skills and expertise to build peace. And by the way, that's my husband and I when we were working for Médicos Sin Fronteras 20 years ago. So full outsiders in Congo. And I'm more than happy to tell you more about all of the problems with our standard approach to peace, but some of you may already be familiar with my argument, and especially the one on outsiders know best, because again, that's one of the main focus of my book that was translated into Spanish by ICIP. Thank you again, my Peaceland book. And what I want to use the few minutes that I have left today to tell you how we can change that, because that's really the focus of the new book. And I really think that we need to learn from success stories instead of always focusing on issues, challenges, and failures. So these past few years, I've looked for cases of what I call unlikely peace, places where everything conspires to cause violence, and yet somehow you have peace, like in Idjwi. And I've found places like that all over the world. In Afghanistan, Congo, in Colombia, in the village here where I took this photo, the one you see on your slide, also in Israel and the Palestinian territory, in Somalia. And I talk about all of these places in the book. And I want to tell you just a little bit more about Somaliland, because that's the example that I like the best. There is a really interesting contrast between, on the one hand, Somalia, which is extremely violent, has some of the highest rankings in the world's least desirable categories, most corrupt country, second most failed state, etc. And on the other hand, you have this autonomous region in the north of Somalia that is called Somaliland, that went through a devastating independence war with Somalia in the late 90s, in the late 80s and in the 1990s, a war that destroyed nearly 90% of the town, some of which still haven't been fully rebuilt, as you can see in the photo I took a few years ago when I was there. But for the past 20 years, Somaliland has experienced little violence, little terrorism, and it now has a well-functioning state, decent public services, and even some kind of functioning democracy. And that's a photo of the capital, Hargeisa, where you can see, the decent public services like electricity and clean streets, etc. And of course, there are many reasons for the difference between Somalia and Somaliland, but the key one is that the usual Peace Inc. outsiders-led top-down approach prevailed in the rest of Somalia, while Somaliland benefited from sustained grassroots peace-building initiatives that were led by insiders, by Somalilanders themselves, just like the people you see now in my photos. And to me, the example of Somaliland shows that local people can have real peace, not only on a small scale, like in Idjwi, but also over a large territory and a quasi-state. And the good news is that we can support these kind of actors and this kind of local efforts without falling into the same old tired relationships between outsiders and insiders that I've told you about and that I'm sure you know very well and that I document in my book, Peaceland, and without destroying local peace efforts as interveners so often do. Because there are role models we can learn from. And I talk about these people a lot in the Frontlines of Peace. They're named Vijay Thakur, Peter Van Holden, James Camberry, Lemak Bowe. I could go on and on. They come from all over the world and they work for very different organizations in very different countries, but they have a few things in common. They don't believe that as outsiders, they know better, that they have the right theories, skills, and expertise, and that they bring the ideal solutions to people's problems. Instead, they respect local residents, they listen to them, and they're open-minded. They understand that other people may have a different understanding of peace, democracy, and development, and different priorities. They also know the local context well. They speak at least some of the local languages and they have extensive local networks. They're in it for the long run. They stay on site for years, sometimes decades. They don't place themselves at the forefront of peace efforts and they don't put their logos everywhere, but instead they remain low profile and they turn the spotlights on the achievements of their local partners, local organizations, local staff, local authorities. They are flexible. They keep adapting their strategies based on the results and feedback that they get and the way the situation evolves. And lastly, they understand that sometimes there are hard choices to be made because all good things do not go together. So we may have to choose between worthy goals, for instance, between peace and justice or peace and democracy. And the best interveners understand that they shouldn't be the ones to make these choices. The people who have to live with the consequences of a decision should be the ones making it. And by way of conclusion, there is one last thing that I want to mention. All of these ideals, all of these lessons from conflict zones can help us address not only tensions in war zones around the world, but also political, ethnic, religious, cultural conflicts in the United States and in Europe. And if you're interested, I'm more than happy to tell you more about that during the discussion. I have an entire chapter on that. But the overall point is that whether at home or abroad, we sorely need more individuals like the inhabitants of Idjwi and Somaliland. We sorely need more organizations that work like the Life and Peace Institute and more programs that follow the basic principles that I've told you about. Because it's with organizations and programs like these that we can help the 1.5 billion people who live under the threat of violence in conflict zones around the world, and that we can also decrease tensions and violence in our own communities in Barcelona, in New York, wherever we live. And of course, all of these ideas are not magic wands, but because they take into account deeply rooted causes of conflict, they can definitely be game changers. So thank you for listening. If you'd like to know more about all of that, please do ask a question now. As Kristian said, you can put your questions in the chat and Kristian will moderate the discussion. You can also follow me on social media. Twitter is where I'm usually the most active. You can find the full text of all of my articles. I think 2 of them have been translated into Spanish. And you can also find a lot of resources that you may enjoy on my webpage, severineautesserre.com. And of course, my 3 books have a lot more stories, details, and ideas about everything that I've told you about today. And I actually consider the Frontlines of Peace as the best of my 3 books. So I'd be really honored if you would check it out. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you again for listening.
Thank you so much, Séverine, for this introduction. I encourage everybody who has questions or comments to post them in the chat. We have 1 question already. But before we move to these questions from the audience, we'll ask Leslie Ann, again, for those who have joined us a little bit later. Leslie is Research Fellow at IBEI, the Barcelona Institute of International Studies. Leslie, your comments, observations, or whatever you'd like to say on this.
Thank you so much. I want to thank ICIP and GlobalCodes first for inviting me to respond. I'm hugely honoured. And I want to say thank you so much to Séverine for the book. I so enjoyed it and I find it really inspiring. And in your book, you give the example of a colleague who says that he cannot give your book at the beginning of his course because all of the students convert themselves to being followers of your ideas. And I can so sympathize with that point. I find the book very inspiring. And I think this emphasis on the local level is a really important development. I want to focus on 2 questions. And my questions are a little bit pushing the ideas a bit further because I think they are so important and I think they ought to be taken forward. So in the book, you're focusing on the international community, of course, because you're speaking to the peace building community, and you're arguing that they should be helping these very local efforts, which I think is a fantastic development. But I want to think about what happens when then we try to scale that up to the bigger level. And at that stage, we can't just have the international level, the local level, we've got to start to bring in the national level. And there were 2 features of the examples that you gave that I thought made the stories extremely appealing, but also seemed to me to be problems when you tried to scale up. And one was that many of the examples go under the radar. So either they're isolated havens or places that can create peace within their own area. And the second is the emphasis that you have on individuals, on highly committed individuals who inspire respect within their community. And I'm not going to make the argument that it's hard to find these individuals because I've known them, I've worked with them. I know that there are so many people at the grassroots level that, as you say, know their communities best. But I wonder what happens when you start to scale up these initiatives and then the top and the bottom have to work together. So what happens when these examples go more public and these individuals start to clash with the status quo? And so I'm thinking of Colombia, where according to the UN, more than 100 activists have been killed every year in the past few years. So I have questions about how do we bring in the domestic level, and specifically questions around interests. So whose interests take priority? What happens when those interests do not align? How do you try to get the interests of the national level to align with those of the local level? So that we don't just have these local initiatives happening in isolation, but so that they can scale up. And then the other question is about power. So who drives the process? Who protects the process? So that was my first overarching question, was how do we bring in the national level, or how do we scale up these inspiring stories? And the second question that I wanted to ask you about was the balance between letting the local groups decide and define what peace means for them, and then these more international norms of human rights. So you say that it's for the local groups to decide what their peace is. I mean, I come from Northern Ireland, and in Northern Ireland in the 1940s, the 1950s, we had peace, but it was on the back of enormous structural discrimination. So the local level is not a homogeneous entity. So what happens when women are not allowed at the table? What happens when a minority group are not allowed at the table? What if the meaning of peace is different within different groups? And what if one group has the power and it imposes its will on the other group? What is your feeling for the role of the international community there? So you give the example that they can bring examples from other places, which is fantastic, but should they also have, what's the balance between trying to stress these international rights and move the community towards those rights, or having a very hands-off process and placing the trust in the community? So that is my second overarching question, this balance. Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Leslie. Séverine, can you still take Albert immediately, or how do you prefer to go on?
Well, actually, now that you give me the choice, if I can respond directly to Leslie, that may
be better, because they are quite loaded themselves, and then we'll have Albert.
And because, thank you, Leslie, these are wonderful questions and wonderful comments, and I want to make sure that I do them justice. And so if I listen to Albert first, then I'm going to forget half of what I wanted to tell you. So if it's okay with Albert as well. Okay, perfect. So thank you, Leslie. You've asked the two questions that I've been struggling with the most as I was writing this book and researching this book, and so on the first question, basically on the scale-up example, on the scale-up question, to me, what's really important is the example of Somaliland, and that's why I like it so much. It's because Somaliland shows that it's not the grassroots effort that I talk about don't need to remain hyper-localized. They can extend to a large territory. You remember the map that I showed? Somaliland is as big as countries like Syria or North Korea. The population in Somaliland is 3.5 to 4 million people, so as large as the population of Uruguay or Bosnia. And what's really interesting is that in Somaliland, they've managed to link top-down and bottom-up efforts. They've managed to link the hyper-local grassroots level to the national level, thanks to their very specific culture, history, and society. So you remember, as I show in the book, they build on the clan system, which is specific to Somaliland and Somalia. They build on the respect for elders, the importance of Islamic laws and values, etc. And the result is that their peace building and state building strategy and the connection between local and national levels, and the way national level elites were included and were managed in the process was very much built on the very specific culture and the very specific opportunities and challenges of Somaliland. And there is another linkage that I develop in the book. That's the one about gun violence in the United States. You remember? And to me, what these examples show, in answer to your questions, is that we don't have a formula, we don't have a template, we don't have a checklist. It's all context specific on a case-by-case basis, really depends on the specifics of violence, of peace building at a very specific time and place. And so that goes back to the main points I developed throughout the book. You know, everything has to be context specific, and that's why it's important to have people who know the specific cultures, histories, etc. Be in charge of everything. It's something that takes time, etc., etc. And the international actors, what they can do is they can provide protection. They can provide not only IDs from elsewhere, funding. You remember in Somaliland, they provided funding, but low-key funding. They can provide protection, which is really important, and which is, I think, one of the main contributions I heard when I was talking with people in Colombia, in the zones of peace. So yes, there is a role for international actors, and they can also make the connections between local and grassroots activists and elites, because national level elites, as we all know, tend to respond a lot more to a powerful peacekeeper or to the head of a diplomatic representation than to an ordinary villager in their country, sadly. And that leads to the second question, which is literally the one that I struggled with until the very end of the research and writing for the book, which is the way I rephrase it in my word is what to do when values clash. What to do when you want, let's say, to promote both peace and gender equality, or in San Jose de Apartado in Colombia, they were telling me about peace and development, peace and justice. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about that. The first thing is that we have to acknowledge that, as I was saying, all good things do not go together. Yes, it would be fantastic if we could promote peace, justice, democracy, human rights, gender equality as a package deal, but we can't. And it's really important that we stop trying and that we acknowledge that there are tensions between these two things. And then still, I was not satisfied with this answer. And I actually, what I did is that I asked the very question you asked me. I asked it to people who get the short end of the stick, meaning women in Somaliland, pygmies in Idjwi, people who get discriminated and who suffer from the peace that is ongoing. And I asked them, so what do we do? And they say, you know what? This is what you do is that you ask us and we decide. We decide if we want gender equality or if we want peace above all else. We decide whether we want justice or whether we want peace. It has to be our decision. And then they told me, we decide what to prioritize. We get to decide whether you're going to have, peace is going to be step 1, democracy is going to be step 2, and hopefully gender equality is going to be step 3. So that's for Somaliland. And to me, that's a really good rule of thumb. And it goes very well again with everything that I've been saying, that we need to let people who leave the conflict decide on how they want us to approach the conflict.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And now over to Albert Carames. He's the coordinator of a master's program on peace and conflict at Blanquerna University in Barcelona.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to GlobalCodes and ICIP for having invited me for commenting Séverine Autesserre book. It's been, as Leslie mentioned, it's been inspiring, and I would like to thank you for your contribution, even coming from the previous one, Peaceland, and several articles I had the honor to read. Specifically on that one, not only for the impact that I'll come later on my question, but also on the language that you're using, and not only for the fact of using around 12 examples, but the fact of using daily basis examples, even putting yourself as an example when you were reading your first book on Kosovo on the plane on the way going, but also plenty of examples that we should full aware, and I feel represented as a former practitioner. I want to set 3 main questions. While Leslie focus on the scaling up from local to national level, I want to focus on the international level, on local level, and then a general one. On the international level, coming from your critics on Peaceland and appreciation of moving to these successful local stories, well, I'm fully aware that you should follow the Chatham House rules, so I cannot ask you the outputs of your meeting with the UN Security Council, which is obvious. But coming from the spirit on deconstructing this Peace Inc. Industry, mindset, spirit, how optimistic, realistic do you feel are we able to deconstruct and move to the peace manifesto you are proposing on your book? For sure, there are plenty are coming of successful, not only a grassroots initiative, but also organizations, as you mentioned, for example, the Life and Peace Institute. That could be a good initiative. How realistic or optimistic are you on that stage? Bearing in mind that even we are on this peace thing, we are moving on this transition from liberal to post-liberal peace, where we are calling about local ownership, but the Peace Inc. is not yet flexible, and it's not yet on the back seat or on the driving process. That's my first question. The second one on the successful local stories. I really agree, and I really joined the initiative, which is always challenging. My question goes on your perception as per your experience. Don't you fear on the risk to reproduce some models of power imbalance when we are trying to reproduce local stories? For sure, we need to go to effective interveners, to grassroots initiatives that are successful. But my fear is that with all time we're looking to the empowerment of these local stories. We're always fixing on this binary local international, and we need to move not only to this power structure, but on the difference. Are we able to find the difference as per main value on these successful local stories that not only counter the international initiative, but find a complementarity and alternative depending on the context specific case? That from your examples, but in general for your experience and perception, I would like to know your point on that. And finally, my third question, in general, apart from here on this webinar, and in my case, as I'm coordinating a master, we have plenty of students that will dream to join an international stakeholder organization, to be peacekeeping, to go to any international NGOs. Apart from reading your books, articles, etc., what would you recommend to tell them what to get inspired, on what to look, which kind of lenses they need to focus once they starting their professional career? Thank you.
Of course, I'm muted. I do that at least once during every single Zoom thing, and it's been a year that I do. Anyway, so thank you so much, Albert, for your very close reading of the book, and for your questions and your comments. So yes, for the UN Security Council, they told me not to do anything and not to say anything. But to me, the very fact that I was actually invited to present, to talk about the Frontlines of Peace at the United Nations Security Council, it's like, wow. Like when I started working on my first book and the trouble with the Congo for my dissertation, and when I remember I was asking diplomats what they were doing to resolve local conflicts and how they were building on local people and ordinary people, and they literally didn't understand the question. Like it was so far away from the mental map that they didn't understand the question. And then when they started understanding the question, they would be like, oh, are you working on sexual violence? Like, no. Why would you think so? I mean, sexual violence is one of the many forms of violence, but it's not. So like the idea of local conflict resolution, building on insiders, that was completely out of the mental map. And when I asked my follow-up questions, people kept getting a bit annoyed at me for asking these questions, and I got kicked out or locked out of a number of offices. While now I get to be invited to talk about the same ideas to the United Nations Security Council. And I've also been invited to talk about this book to a lot of, at the United Nations, a lot of different United Nations agencies and peacekeeping organizations and non-governmental organizations and think tanks, etc. So to me, it shows that it answers your question because there is a move. To me, it shows there is a move in the right direction. People are interested in that, and as Oscar and Leslie and Kristian were saying, the idea of local conflict resolution, putting people in charge, now it's something that we talk about. And of course, it's all over the place in academia. Like all of us work on it and talk about it and think about it and obsess about it. But also when you look at policymakers, and I agree with Leslie that there is a widening gap between policymakers and academics. But still, we can see that policymakers are also moving in the right directions, and practitioners. There is at least lip service to the idea of putting insiders in charge, local conflict resolutions, addressing all of the issues I mentioned in Peaceland, following the kind of models that I lay out in the Frontlines of Peace. And when I present my research, I often have someone who says, oh, but yeah, that's what we say in the report that we wrote 2 years ago, 1 year ago, in the mandate. So in the discourse, it's there. And sometimes, you know, the idea of local empowerment, to me, that sounds like a buzzword. So the problem, and there I completely agree with you, Albert, in practice, we still have a very, very long way to go. In practice, Peace Inc. still rules the show. Everything still gets decided by people in headquarters and capital cities. There are very few people who work like my role models. But to me, the fact that they exist is a reason for hope. And that's why when you ask me how optimistic are you, I'm a very optimistic person in general, but I do think like these people really give me hope. I literally found role models and people who really managed to make a difference at the highest level and on the ground, who follow the models of being flexible, building on the knowledge of insiders, etc. I found them within all kinds of different organizations, at the headquarters in the United Nations, on the ground in a rural village, working for a peacekeeping mission. I found them within non-governmental organizations, within foreign affairs ministries in many different countries. So they're there, and what they tell me is that they keep working on it. Not only they do what I consider to be the right thing, but they keep advocating for their ideals. And they tell me that the book is actually something that they use now so that they can further advocate for their ideas. And so to me, I'm really optimistic. I know that it's going to take decades. I know it's going to be imperfect. I know it's going to be 2 steps forward, 3 steps backwards. I know there are going to be a lot of challenges, but I think we're moving in the right direction. I hope I'm not wrong. On the successful local stories and the fear of reproducing models of power imbalance, that's why to me the LPI story that I'm mentioning is so important, because when LPI tries to resolve a conflict, they really include everyone in the definition of the problem and the solution and the implementation. And so that includes very powerful people, but also powerless people. They include ordinary citizens. And that's why also it's really important to have people who have local knowledge, so that you can know, so what are the power relationships? What is the power imbalance? Which are the groups that are likely to be excluded from the discussions, from the negotiations, from the benefits of peace? And how can we effectively include them in the peace process, in the definition of the problem, of the solution? And how can we make sure that, you know, at least they don't suffer more from the peace that we're trying to build? Again, it's a matter, as we were discussing with Leslie, we can't have everything at the same time, but at least try not to worsen the power imbalance, but if possible, using the peace process to rebalance just at least a little bit. And to me, LPA has been really successful at doing that in the few places where they've really used this participatory action research. And to me, the very approach that they have, the participatory action research, you know, building on the skills of people experiencing the conflict, that in itself, and valuing their knowledge, that in itself is a way to correct the power imbalance, and it's an empowerment technique that's been used in social justice initiatives in many other contexts in all over the world. And on your third question, so yes, I do have a lot of advice for students, because my students are the same as yours, and they hope that one day they're going to be able to join these kind of international organizations and do good work on the ground. And so the thing I tell them, I usually tell them there are 3 things that they can do. And do you remember the little stick figure that I was showing you at the end? So the little stick figure, one of the big thing is what I tell my students: be humble. But seriously, like, don't arrive somewhere think that you have the right theory, skills, and expertise, and that, you know, you're God's gift to the world. And it's important, because some of my students graduating with a master's from Columbia University, I was one of them, you know, 20 years ago, I know how you feel, when you finally have your master's and you're like, yeah, I can save the world. Well, you can't. So just telling them, like, the first advice is, like, realize that people who live in the conflict, who may have no master's degrees, no education, no formal wealth, no formal source of power, they know a lot about how to resolve their own conflicts. And they know a lot about their own situation. So listen to them, learn to listen. And that's really one of the first things I tell them is learn to listen, not to hear, but to actually listen. And then I tell them, if you want to be like one of my model interveners, you have to learn the local languages. So when they're still at school, I push them to take language classes so that they can actually communicate with people when they're on the ground, and also try to learn about the specific histories, politics, cultures of the places where you'll want to work in. And I tell them also to go in there for the long run, to keep in mind that if they want to be good, effective interveners, it's not like the idea of going from place to place 6 months, like I did at the beginning of my career, 6 months in Kosovo and then 6 months in Congo, and then, oh, let's go to Afghanistan. That was rewarding for me and that was interesting for me. But I'm not sure that was really good for Kosovo people and Afghan people and Congolese people. So I tell them, when you go somewhere, try really to be involved over the long run, because that's what makes a difference.
All right, then. Thank you, Séverine. We have a number of questions from the audience, and what I suggest, in order to be able to look into as many as possible, I read them and you give quick responses to the ones I pick, if that's fine with you. And I know it's always a challenge, but this way we might be able to get through as many as possible. Some of them I will just group together. Like the first one was posed by Daniel Wegeland, but very similar to the one posed by Emma. Are you aware of cases of these success stories being able to maintain their heavens of peace, the face of an armed group, to move in or conquer the area? Do these islands of peace require a combination of neglect by armed groups and or establishing their own fighting forces? Mute.
And again, so yes, absolutely. And the opening story of the Idjwi chapter was actually an armed group that wanted to set up on Idjwi Island, and people managing to make the efforts fail. And there are plenty of the zones of peace that I mentioned where they do manage to maintain their heaven of peace. Somaliland, so Somalia has been trying to take over Somaliland for the past 20 years. They still have an active conflict, and Somalilanders have managed to maintain their heaven of peace. And so to me, what really helps is that the grassroots activists that I mentioned throughout my book, they have a lot of networks, they have a lot of contacts, and many of them actually get involved personally to call on the leaders of armed groups to negotiate, to use their personal, professional, to use all kinds of relationships to maintain the peace. And again, we have top-down intervention, which is also very helpful. So that's why, again, we need sometimes to have international and national involvement, as we were talking with Leslie. Have I been brief enough to answer this question, Kristian?
That's fine. So here comes the next from Samira Yasmin. I'm curious about whether or not you discovered what hindrances exist in local ownership and participation in peace process.
Oh, well, yeah. So many hindrances, and there are all of those that I document in my Peaceland book, and that I mention also I have 2 chapters on the problems with the Peace Inc. approach. And the Peace Inc. approach, the Peace Incorporated, the traditional top-down approach, it's all about creating hindrances to local participations, from the way we value knowledge to our everyday routines, to the kind of often racist and prejudiced way that we can see in many relationships between local actors and international actors. And also, obviously, there are a lot of local hindrances to local ownership and participation. There are power conflicts, as we've been discussing, at the local level, just like at the national level. There are people who try to excuse others. There are non-governmental organizations that are corrupted, that are no better than the national leaders. So there are all of these hindrances. But again, what's interesting is that there are organizations that do differently. There are role models, and that's what I want to focus on. Is we all know of all of the hindrances, all of the challenges, all of the issues, but the next step is to look at the ones that do things differently, so that we can get over these hindrances.
Cool. So here comes a question from Colombia, Felipe Piedrahita. He's wondering, what are the relationships that can be established between peace-building models based on participatory action research and the current discussions on everyday peace indicators?
That's I've never had that question before, and I'm thinking about it. So, completely off the top of my mind, first, I'm a huge fan of the Everyday Peace Indicator project. I just blurbed the book by Roger McGinty that's based on this, and that's going to come out, and it's a fantastic work. I think the relationship are that whether we're talking about Pamina Fiershow, Roger McGinty, I've been in touch with so many people who work on the Everyday Peace Indicator. I think we feel that we're part of the same team, and we work for the same goal. We say the same things. We say them differently. We focus on different things. So, for instance, the Everyday Peace Indicator is very much based on how do you evaluate, how do you evaluate programs. Roger's new book is very much showing that ordinary people have power and can disrupt conflict. I'm looking at the international aspects and at successful cases, and I think that we all we get at the same idea, we have the same goal, and we get at it from different angles, because hopefully that way eventually that's gonna lead to good results. And if you were to see any of our books, we cite each other quite extensively. In my Peaceline book, I cite several of the publications of the Everyday Indicator project quite a lot, and Roger, and well, anyway, so we cite each other quite a lot, because I think that the participatory action research and the Everyday Indicator project, they are very two complementary methodologies. One of them, I would say, would be for how do you design the program, and then the other one would be how do you evaluate the program, and you can merge the two because obviously there is a lot of overlap in that.
Okay, over to Masika Daniela. She asks, when we are thinking about conflicts in which there are rebel groups that are supported by foreign states and fighting forms of proxy wars, and whose grievances seem to be tied to issues that are rooted in other countries, does a local approach still apply, and in what way? Or are these situations better addressed by traditional diplomacy?
Thank you. So if it's a completely, so of course, if it's a completely international conflict where the stakes are only international, then of course you need to have the traditional diplomatic approach. But what we see in these proxy wars or things that we consider to be proxy wars or mostly international wars is that you often have, or virtually always have, local stakes and local dilemmas and local agendas, and that's basically the work of Stathis Kalyvas. He was one of the first one to show that, and then quite a few researchers have shown that he was entirely right. So there are always local motivations to any kind of foreign country or proxy war. And so the local approach is really good to address these local motivations. And also, I have a couple of examples in the book of conflicts that we tended to analyze as a proxy war, for instance, a proxy war between Congo and Rwanda. And then when we spent time really digging down and trying to understand what was going on, we realized that it was not at all an international or national conflict, but that it was actually a very local conflict. So I would say it's also really important to make 100% sure before we go to the standard diplomatic approach, making 100% sure that this is indeed a proxy war. And I have this wonderful case for those of you who've read the book, the Ruzizi Plain story, to me really shows how if you assume it's a proxy war, you can have the kind of approach that will actually make the situation worse. While if you try to take time to understand, you understand what the conflict is really about, then you can have the approach that resolves the conflict. And of course, like I could answer this question in 10, 15 minutes. I'm just trying to be brief as Kristian has asked me.
And I think that's working just fine. Here comes a question from Colleen Cardeno. Would you also advise for local actors or peace builders to learn best practices from other parts of the world or theoretical developments discussed in academia? Any recommendations to strengthen North-South collaboration and peace-building efforts? And I assume this is my own interpretation. It responds a little bit maybe to what you suggested before about your students. And like, well, and here's a question. So where is academic knowledge being developed, right?
Right. So I would say for local actors, what I've understood from my model peace builders who are local actors, domestic peace builders in their communities, is that best practices are helpful as a way to think about, to get ideas, not because you would want to take the best practices and apply them directly, but because learning how other local actors have done in a specific situation when they were confronting a problem that were similar or related to the one that you're confronting at the time, that gives you ideas, that gives you a way to look at the problem differently, that gives you a different way to approach the situation. And so in that way, yes, best practices or success stories are the things that are helpful. And on how to strengthen North-South collaboration and Kristian's question on where academic knowledge is produced, there is I completely agree with what you're implying, Kristian. Academic knowledge so far is produced predominantly in the North or the West, however you want to call it, and there is a huge power imbalance. There are many efforts at redressing this power imbalance for example, we're talking about the Everyday Indicator project. I know that they're really trying hard to make sure that Colombian and Ugandan researchers get to participate just as much in the production of knowledge as Western researchers. And there are many other academics who could try, and it's like the question that Albert asked me: Are you optimistic? Well, I see a lot of discourse. I see a lot of people saying that it matters, that we need to do something better. So it's the first step has been taken. At least we acknowledge that there is a huge problem and we need to work on it. There are exceptions. There are people who are role models, who are really trying hard to make a better North-South collaboration a reality. Now we have a really long way to go, and I include myself in this thing, because at Columbia University we're not models in this.
Okay, so I think we are approaching an end now. I'll hand over the floor to Oscar to ask one question, and I may drop in my own one as well then.
Thanks very much, Kristian, and thanks very much, Séverine, for all your reflections. I'd like to take the conversation up to the first debate that I suggested you about epistemic communities and about like the bridge that it seems to exist sometimes between practitioners and academics. I think that in the last 10, 15 years has been an amazing debate in the critical peace studies field that has led to this local turn, which is widely accepted by almost becoming a new consensus in the academia, right? But I have the impression, as I was highlighting at the very beginning, that this has been, at the end, has become a little bit endogamic, in the sense that I wonder, and this is one of the things that also sometimes in our research group we have been working on, is how this criticism is permeating the way that practitioners at the end of the day, especially let's put it this way, important or big international stakeholders like the UN, for instance, to what extent practitioners, the UN agencies, big donors are really or feel challenged by this type of criticism, and to what extent they are reviewing the way they try to develop their own strategies. That's why I was suggesting that your work, I think it's trying to be to place in between of these two communities, trying to bridge some of the problems that sometimes these two epistemic communities have in communicating each other. I don't know, I'd like to know which is your impression about this particular aspect.
If you allow me, Séverine, actually my question is very much related, so I'll throw it in now and then you can take both of them. I think Oscar is asking more on the academic policymaker divide. My background is a practitioner. I've been working in the last 10 years with conciliation resources in places like Mindanao, the Basque Country, and also in Colombia. And the approach of that organization and all of our colleagues in multiple countries and elsewhere is very much what your book is advocating for. To be honest, coming from this background, reading the book, it's like, well, so what's the point? What's new? This is what we have been doing and advocating for more than 20 years, which makes me wonder, therefore, if you can add another angle to the gap, then the gap also between the practitioner perspective, very much in line with Life and Peace Institute's experience. There's dozens, hundreds of organizations which work with the approach of Life and Peace Institute, as you know very well, to which what you're saying here is exactly the same thing they've been advocating for years and years. So where do you see the debate going and your contribution to bridging these gaps?
Thank you so much. I think it's the perfect two questions to end the discussion. On the Oscar, on your question, the academic practitioners divide. Yes. So what I feel when I'm meeting with people at the United Nations headquarters or in big non-governmental organizations or in foreign affairs ministries is that they're aware of the whole debate that we have in academia. They're quite a bit defensive. And I get a lot of defensive, angry reactions. Why are you criticizing, etc., etc. So there is this kind of, at least in the United States, in North America, I really feel a kind of distrust that has been growing over the past 10 years between academics and practitioners. And when you go to places like Congo, for instance, there is really a huge gap because peacekeepers are so much on the defensive that any researcher or journalist that they see, they assume we're here to criticize them, and so it makes research and discussion really, really hard. And I think that yes, as you say, we academics have a huge responsibility in that, in the fact that we don't build the bridge as well as we could. I think that Wheaton and the work on local peace building, etc. It's fascinating. It's beautiful. I find it personally very jargony. very abstract. So I can imagine that people who are peacekeepers, who are based in conflict zones, they have a really hard time understanding it and focusing on things that are very theoretical and very abstract. And so to me, that's what I was trying to do with the Frontlines of Peace. Is you've seen the book. I've been really trying hard to stay away from jargon, to base the argument on stories, to make the book enjoyable to read and interesting, and also to phrase it in a, instead of phrasing like Peaceland, which was, as one of my hosts mentioned last week, it was very much in your face. And the trouble with the Congo was also very much in your face, like, here is everything that you're doing wrong. The Frontlines of Peace is much gentler. It's more, hey, look at everything that people are doing right. You can do that as well. It works within your own organization. So I think it's going to be easier. I hope it's going to be easier for policymakers and practitioners to use the book because it's less aggressive. It's much more diplomatic in a way. And the other thing is that, you know, now you and I and Albert and Leslie, we have a lot of students whom we've trained in these kind of debates and who are now working for international organizations, for non-governmental organizations, for foreign affairs ministries. And to me, that's, you know, when we're talking about building a bridge, our students are actually a huge way for us to build a bridge, because when I keep getting emails from my former students and they're using what they've read and what we've told them, they're using them in these ideas in their daily work. So they are making the bridge themselves, and they are taking these ideas and trying to implement them on the ground, which I think is one of the biggest source of influence that we have as academics. And Kristian, on your questions, basically what's new? Well, yes, there are a lot of organizations like Life and Peace Institute, Peace Direct, like a lot of organizations that have been advocating for these ideas. The thing is that they remain a minority in the international peace building system. They also, most of the time, they're not well known. They're not the kind of organizations that, you know, if my grandmother, well, she's dead. If my mother wants to write a check to a peace building organization, she's not going to think about Peace Direct or anything like that. She's going to, or LPI, she's going to think about UNICEF or one of these big organizations that, to me, work from the top down. When you look at the resources that are spent in international peace building, I think yes, there was this new report that was published yesterday, showing that the direct funding to local groups and funding to organizations that work in international aid in general, that work the way you and I think they should be working, it's decreased actually in the past 10 years from 3.2%, 3 point something to 2 point something. Like even 3 point something is nothing. Like it means that more than 95% of all of the funds are still going to the organizations that work differently. And so what's new to me, what's new is, first, we've known that what's new is the focus on success, the focus on like trying to show that this works, that this is possible within all organizations, that there are role models we can follow, that this is effective, and that we can actually follow these models and use these ideas. What's new is also the move to peace, because it's been a very long-term debate in development. It's starting only in the past 20 years to move to peace. And again, in the debate on peace, and that's going to be, I promise I'll stop talking after that. In the debate on peace, as we're talking, as I was saying when I was answering Oscar's question, usually we focus on criticizing. We focus on saying, this doesn't work, this is why it doesn't work, these are the problems, these are the issues, these are the challenges. And I think that all of that is super interesting, but we also need to look as academics, you know, as thinkers, as writers, we also need to look at things that work, because if you, Kristian, as a practitioner say, oh, what I do works, I'm going to tell you, yeah, of course you're going to tell me you're doing a good job because that's your role to tell me that you're doing a good job. Now, if I tell like someone who don't know your organization, or have no personal relationship, if I say what they're doing is really important and we should learn from it, I think that has a different weight. And that's what I'm trying to do with the book, is really to help turn the spotlight to all of the people doing wonderful work, who have been doing wonderful work for 20 years, but who still get very little funding, very little attention, very little media spotlights, and who hopefully will get a bit more of that in the coming years.
Wonderful, Séverine. Thank you so much. Transforming unjust power relations. I think in 3 words, that's what you're trying to do there. And I think that's what peace building is all about. And because the issue is too big for anyone to be able to solve it by its own, obviously we need to build bridges, relations, and learn from each other between scholars, practitioners, policymakers, people living in conflict and surviving in conflict-affected zones, people who have the privilege of living in other places. It's a common challenge. There's not enough of us doing this kind of work, so every contribution is helpful and welcome. And this one, obviously, we're very glad it is having the impact it is having, which is, as you just mentioned right now, one of its big contributions. Thank you, Séverine, for having written the book, for sharing it with us. Thank you, Leslie, Albert, for joining the event with your comments and observations. Very glad to organize this together with GlobalCodes, coordinated by Oscar Mateos. Everybody joining us from different places in the world. As I can see, some names are familiar. It's nice to see you all, and I hope you enjoyed this session as I did. See you on the next occasion.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you again for having me.